Alrighty, so we've just hit 4 p.m. So I'd like to begin by saying thank you for coming to this webinar during what I'm sure is a very busy time for a lot of you. So before we begin, I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, Oxford University Press acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. As a bit of an overview of today's session, we're first going to hear from Helen Sylvester about strategies for keyword recognition and responding to science questions. I'll then be talking about some of the new features of the new edition of Oxford Science 7 to 10, which is being published this year. We'll have some time at the end of the session for you to ask us any questions you may have about keyword recognition and responding to science questions, or even about Oxford Science. If you have any questions at all during the presentation, please feel free to pop them into the chat, as some questions will be answered throughout the webinar in the chat. And just as a reminder, please keep your cameras off and microphones on mute. And responding to science. Now I'd like to pass it over to Helen Sylvester. Helen is currently Director at Casey Tech School. She has been an educator for over 20 years. She has held Head of Science positions at a number of schools, and she was shortlisted for 2014 and 2017 Prime Minister's Secondary Science Prize for Excellence in Science Teaching. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us. I always feel old when I start counting up the number of years, or people tell how many years I've been teaching. Before I was teaching, I was also a medical researcher, so teaching was one of my secondary careers that I came to. And the reason for choosing the topic that I did today is something that I've become aware of due to being aware of what's happening in other states, and also something that I noticed that was happening in VCE exams over the last year or two. So the reason for choosing the topic was looking at the key words that are starting to appear. And I know this diagram is something that I was shown 30 plus years ago for the ways of analysing and choosing the types of questions to ask students. And it's something that you take on board when you first start teaching, and it's something that you get reminded of every now and then. The different levels of asking questions, whether you're asking for the reason for choosing the topic was looking at each, can they parrot back the information? Comprehension, are they actually understanding it? Was shown 30 plus years ago. Can they actually use the information to analyse new situations and apply their learnings? And finally, to evaluate. But I never really understood what was meant by each of those until I started reviewing it again about 5 years ago. It was something that, as I said, was reminded of time and time again, but I never really looked at it in depth until more recently. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is the types of things that I was mentioning, that when you're talking to students about or writing questions, asking questions in class, writing them on tests or exams, how do you actually work out what you're after from the students? And I know every now and then you fall into those traps where you say, for example, what is a generator? But you're not quite sure what answers you want. And this is something that we need to train ourselves so that we can train the students, not just the content knowledge and how to apply the content knowledge, but actually how to answer a question. So it's what are you actually looking for by asking that question? So what is a generator? It's a really broad one. Do you mean describe a generator, in that describe what it does? So describe the function of the generator, describe what it looks like, or do you actually mean to explain how a generator works? They're very different types of questions, and students often don't know which way to go for the answers. So can I have the next slide, please? One of the things that I became really aware of was what was happening in Queensland and in New South Wales. So about 4 years ago, 3 years ago, Queensland started becoming more specific with their key action words that they use, and each word had a particular meaning. And that's one of the things that started me rethinking on this journey of thinking how to actually apply each of these. And then I was also aware that New South Wales has become more focused and being more specific in their key action words, that they use keywords. And that led me to go back and look at the VCAR words that was used in last year's exams. And I noticed in the past where previously they might have why or what or potentially name, they actually, I found that in last year's VCAR exams, there was a much, much higher proportion of using these keywords. Where previously they might have had alternative words, these are the words that were appearing up consistently across them. Now, it's not something that they've mentioned specifically yet, but given what's come from Queensland, what's moved down through New South Wales, I fully expect these are going to be some of the ones that start appearing in the VCE exams, which means we need to train the students what each of these words mean and therefore how to answer the questions. So for me, the content knowledge is separate to teaching students how to answer questions. Yes, they can have, I've had brilliant students, but they couldn't put it down on paper and therefore way that meant they were able to get those higher level marks. So it's something that if we spend our time training the year 7 to the year 10s more effectively, then it's one less thing we have to worry about in the VCE. Not that every student goes on and does VCE, but it's also getting them to understand the importance of choosing their words carefully and thinking about what is meant by particular questions or questioning techniques. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, because I don't have control of the slides, I've ended up putting a lot of words on this slide because it would mean I'd change too often. So forgive me for having a lot of words. It's what I try and avoid. But one of the key things that working through what each of these words means, sometimes we need to have a priority of the different words. So define means, what does the word mean? Which means if you go to the next level is describe, are you talking about the appearance, the function, or the process? So whenever you use as describe, define means what does the specify which ones, each ones of those that you mean. And I'll have an example of that in a few minutes. Contrast and compare. These are words that are really difficult for students. They both start with C, both got O. There's not much difference between the N and the M. So if you've got those who struggle to read or have got dyslexia, sometimes they have difficulty understanding the difference between them. If we're talking about differences, we're talking about contrasting between things. Whereas comparing, have difficulty understanding the difference between them. If we're talking, so it's having both. For both contrast and compare questions, the best thing you could do is teach students to have a line down the middle of the page or the answer part of the page and run compare questions. The best thing you could and B, then A goes in one column, B goes in the other column. If it's contrast, you'll talk about the differences between them. If it's compare, first of all, you'll have the similarity in one column, B goes in the other column. Little tricks like that are really, really powerful, and there are ways of introducing these, which again, I'll go through shortly. Explain is the next level of difficulty again. That tends to be about a process or how something occurs. And one of the most effective ways that you can use to teach students about explaining something is to talk about giving the cause and the effect. And I know this is one of the techniques that I really only got my head around when I was teaching VCE students, talking about why does something happen? So what started it happening? What is the middle step? And therefore, what's the outcome of it? So whenever you have explain, you're really looking for at least 2 steps or 2 sentences with that, where which is different. And sometimes you'll have 3 with that middle one. And you can see how that is going to be very different to describe. describe is, again, appearance, functional processes. Explain is the why or the hows, cause and effect. When we talk about discuss, we're talking about presenting a point of view. And that's where sometimes you bring in some of the earlier words. So for me, discuss, you're going to be describing something first. You might be comparing it next, and you'll be able to talk about that's the advantages and limitations. So when it comes to discuss, you're also incorporating those earlier words, which makes it a higher level word to use. So talking about this with students in a reproducible way is actually really important. And that's where it's not just in the science area, but if you can get the keywords across all curriculum areas in your school, it actually makes it more powerful for students, and it means that you're going to have these students have that higher level ability. So discuss means you need to have describe, you need to have compare, and sometimes you'll throw in a bit of explain as well. Analyze is definitely needing to have that explain in there. So describe the essential features. So you're going to have describe, you're going to have compare the similarities and differences, and then you're going to have, which is also the limitations and advantages, but then you're going to identify why they're important. And it's one step. Sometimes you will make a decision, sometimes not with analyze. So it depends on the final outcome. Often if you analyze something, you may need to go to make a decision. So you might need to justify next. So that's where, again, you're looking for evidence. So that's describe. You're going to compare the similarities and differences. You might have a cause and effect in there. You might need to incorporate why different bits are important. Justify, you've got the evidence and you need to make a decision. So you might have to make a decision early and then justify it. So by justifying it, you need to bring in describe, you need to bring in compare, you need to bring in discuss, and potentially the decision that was made. Evaluate combines all of those in one. So one of the important things potentially is to think about what level you're working at. You're probably not going to ask Year 7 students to evaluate things too often. You might have Year 7 students doing define, describe, contrast, compare, maybe explain, and by the end of the year, maybe discuss. Whereas Year 8, you're starting to get into the analysing and potentially justifying by the end of the year. Year 9 and Year 10, justifying and evaluating is something that they should be doing, because that ties into those cross-curricular capabilities where you're trying to get them to think about the critical thinking. So analyze, justify, and evaluate are critical thinking that takes things to the next level above. So you can see how sometimes students will need to understand those first level before to the next level, which if you think in terms of the pyramid that we had, the level of complexity as you move along that pyramid. So these are the ones that appear most commonly in the VCE exams when I was going back through them. Each state has their own variation of the keywords, but these are the ones that I'm finding appeared most often and are most consistent across the states so far. If I can have the next slide, please. So this is an example of it. So defining a generator means that what actually is a generator, and that is tying it in with a machine. So a machine that transforms energy into electrical energy. It was just one of the random examples I brought forward. Explain how a generator works. So if you've got to explain, you've got to think about what you're actually looking for, same as with describe. And you'll notice that the potential answer I gave has a cause and effect. So the generator has a spinning turbine, and where you burn a fuel, wind, or other kinetic energy, and the effect, which should be the second sentence, the movement of a magnet or coil generates electrical current. So you can see how you've got the mention of the turbine, you've got the cause, which is the fuel, the wind or other kinetic energy. You'll make it more specific yourself, and the effect is the movement of generating the electrical current. So you can see if you start having that consistent approach, it will work for multiple possible answers in the way students will do it, and they can apply it across the curriculum areas. My background is science teaching, so I will automatically go to the science examples. If I can have the next slide, please. So this is modeling the different answers. So if you're contrasting the two sides of the photo, contrast is looking at the differences between the two sides of the photo. So you might want to contrast the appearance of them. So that would be at the first level for students, and looking at the green, which implies that they've got lots of plant growth, and you might have the other side which has no plant growth. So you're contrasting the appearance or the two environments on the left and the right side of the photo. Then you might get them to identify the cause. So identify is just naming the potential cause of this change in the environment. Obviously, one side has water, the other side has a lack of water, is the assumption that we're making based on the colours of the photo. It could also potentially be as a result of pollution, so some sort of pollution that is stopping plant growth. There is a number of possible causes. So you might need to provide a greater level of detail for the students. But that's the difference between contrast versus identify. Contrast, you're just looking for a description, whereas identify, the cause, means you're actually after something shorter and simpler. Explain why the environment changed. So that's different to identify. If you want them to provide a cause and effect, so making that link, it's a much higher level approach to your questioning. So cause means the same as identifying the cause, but explaining how that cause gave the effect. So a lack of water meant that the plants weren't able to photosynthesize, which therefore means no plants were able to grow. It might be that pollution in the environment affected the normal functioning of the plants, which meant all the plants died. That's the effect. So you can end up with multiple possible answers, but as long as they have the cause and the effect, therefore they've achieved what you're actually setting out for in the answers. And this is where it's actually really important to think, when you write a question, think of the possible answers that you can be involved with. I know I'm sometimes involved in writing exam papers for a variety of companies. And in that, one of the key things that I will never put anything out until I've got those sets of answers, and that involves in how to approach the actual question. So thinking about which words you can describe the two sides of the environment, which would be similar to contrasting, or you can have explain which you must have that cause, you must have that effect, and they must be linked in some way. Analyze how the environment might have changed. That means you need to be able to compare the essential features. You need to be able to explain, so the relationship between the two, or different, so similarities and differences, and you might need to explain why it's important. So analyzing the two sides is looking at the similarities between them. It is a similar environment. You've got different skylines. You've got the different types of plants. You might be looking at why that might have occurred. So if it's the same environment, how that might have changed. So you can see the level of complexity increases as you go. You've got to have that consistent approach so the students know how much depth to go into. And it's a way of getting that critical thinking happening a lot faster. Can I have the next slide, please? So one of the ways that you can do it, and I was thinking how to explain that, is often having the cognitive verbs next to each other. So I'm looking at questions 2 and questions 3 here. So this is one of the things, the approaches that I actually think is really important, is having compare, and then in brackets the similarities and differences between, and then have contrast underneath it of the differences between. So when I've been introducing it to students in the past, I might have compare with the brackets after it, contrast with the brackets after it, and then immediately after it I might have just compare with no brackets underneath it. So it gets the students thinking, okay, compare, that meant that. So it's encouraging them to have that consistent approach each time. I might have compare with the brackets, so compare and then the brackets around it, and then I'd have compare with no brackets around it. So have two compare questions comparing different things, but again, it gets them thinking about what the difference or what that word actually means and what they need to incorporate in that answer. Same goes with define versus identify. Identify is just straight out naming, whereas define means explaining what it means. So having those next to each other to actually compare, to use my own words, to compare and to potentially contrast the meanings of those different words. The next slide, please. So gradually increasing the complexity, and this again was just an example. I was thinking of how to have it. So you can see that I've got a couple of identify questions in there, and then I've got an evaluate question. And with the evaluate question, I've said by answering the following. So evaluate questions, you need to have identify, you need to have an explain, you need to have a decide in there. And you'll notice that with the next evaluate question, there's the identify, there's the explain, there's the decide in there. So if you can have those explicit and reproducible approaches, it means that students over time are going to develop those greater detailed answers, which are going to be incredibly powerful when students are moving on. So gradually increasing the complexity of the answers allows them to see how the different definitions are linked. So next slide, please. So providing consistent hints. So evaluate, when you've got evaluate, you need a decision in there. That's what evaluate actually means, is having a decision and being able to back up your decision. So again, evaluate, I've got compare, then deciding on the answer based on the comparisons. So being able to go back and make those key, I know I'm repeating myself, I do this with students, but again, going back and having that reproducible approach, that is something that is really powerful for students, and they will get that higher level. And I know the first year I started doing this with VCE students, because I hadn't twigged that I needed to do it in junior ones, it increased the students' marks quite considerably and shifted the whole cohort up to a much higher level at a VCE level. So because they knew the content, and we know this a lot of times, we will see students who are able to verbally give an answer with a little bit of prompting, but they can't put it on paper because they're not understanding what the question's actually asking for. So having this reproducible approach is really powerful. So next slide, please. So other things that I thought are worthwhile mentioning, because I was thinking in terms of other things that I have learned over time, is being aware of auditory processing issues. So some of the things I find with students is when you're asking questions in class, they're not always picking up those key words that you're asking or looking for, or gives an indication of the depth of the question that you're after. So maybe having a list of the key words on the board and just pointing at the key word is really, really useful for students when you're saying, can you describe this? Can you contrast this? So pointing at those particular words, keywords, as you ask the questions in class, That will give the students a hint. You can have posters around the room. I know Queensland Education Department has some beautiful posters on how to approach each of the questions, but having it written so that those with auditory processing problems will be more confident in answering the question. Next slide, please. So the other one that's really powerful is time to think about the answer to the question. And I know I have had groups of students who don't want to put up their hand because they're not sure how to answer the question. And you can point at particular students or have their names to get them to answer the question. I find students who are not confident and can be anxious, that can actually increase the anxiety in class, and you can actually have student refusing to come to class because of that. So one of the little tricks I have found is give students time to think. So I ask the question and then I would get them to say, all right, turn to the person next to you and discuss what answer you think would be the best answer between the pair of you. So that way all the effect of the students coming up with the answer and them individually becoming possibly being wrong is shared, and that gets rid of the embarrassment and brings down the anxiety. So I get all students, I very rarely call out students individually. I get them to give them time to think, discuss the answer. And my standard thing is that when they agree on a potential answer, to shake hands. Now, it's a bit hard in a COVID environment at the moment, but what you can do is a number of different alternatives to it. So bump fists is actually more effective because there's got less contact if they bump their fists. So if they agree on an answer in the last 12 months or so, I'd get them to bump their fists. And it's a quick look around the room of who's bumped fists to check whether they're actually talking about the question itself. Then I would, rather than ask them about what their answers are, and I have done that from time to time, but often I will give the answer and get them to give each other a high five if they got it correct. And that is really important to me as a teacher, because that gave me formative feedback. If you saw students give a high five, you knew that they were understanding the content, and you'd have students who wouldn't necessarily give each other a high five because they didn't get the right answer. And that's, again, formative feedback for me as a teacher of how many students are understanding it and which students I might need to walk around next to next time to be able to think about whether or not they're understanding the content. So doing that, give them time to think. So talk to the person, to use the phrases I use, talk to the person next to you, work out and see if you can agree on an answer, bump fists when you agree. And then once everyone's bumped fists, and I always check everyone's got a bump fist before I'll give them the answer, then I'll give them the answer, my version of the answer, and why it is why it might get good marks. Then I'd get them a high five if you would have got full marks for that question. Formative feedback for me as a teacher, really, really powerful. Once I started doing this in class, I found that I was doing it in all my classes. Great way of improving your teaching and making sure that everyone's understanding content. Next slide, please. Now, this one I was made aware of. There's two parts to this one. Are you biased? I once sat in the back of a class of a teacher just doing normal teaching, normal observations, and just as an interest thing, just worked out which side of the room the teacher was asking the most questions. So because they were writing on the board, when they turned round, the first direction that they turned, which was to their right, then it tended to mean that they would ask students on the right-hand side of their class more often than they'd ask students on the left-hand side of the class, which meant students who on the right-hand side of the class would get greater anxiety if they didn't like answering questions, or they were more likely to get feedback on their answers on one side of the class than the other. And it's actually a really powerful thing to do, because after seeing that with that particular teacher I was observing, I started taking note of whether or not I was doing it myself, and I was. So that is incredibly powerful thing to be aware of. Now, the other thing that I have done is for students who don't like to answer questions, other than the think, pair, share, I have done is I've given each student a plastic cup in front of them. And then I had a container of counters up the front of the class. And every time a student asked a question or answered a question, I put a counter in their cup, because it meant they were contributing to the class. And again, I had a group of students who didn't want to contribute in any way, highly anxious, but if they asked a question, they got a counter. So that meant they could contribute to the class and still by asking a question rather than answering it. And that took away a lot of their anxiety as well. I have set it up as competition. So I had a whole class at one point, a girls' class, that would refuse to answer any questions. So I set them up in teams. I gave them a cup between groups of about 4, and the goal was to get the most counters in your cup. And again, they could ask questions or answer questions, and they would get a counter in their cup. And the team with the most counters would be able to choose one less question to do for homework or something along those lines. For students who didn't get any counters in their cup when it was individual, they would have to ask a question as they before they were allowed to leave the classroom, even if they knew about the answer, just as so that they were able to get those counters. When I set up the competition with groups of 4, I would do groups of 4 for a couple of classes, and then the following week I'd do groups of 3, so making the groups smaller, and then the following week I'd do groups of 2, and then the following week I did groups of 1, so that everyone got used to the idea that they needed to contribute to the class. So this was also to prevent the Hermiones in the class. Now, Hermiones are those that always have their hands up all the time and won't let others get away word in edgeways. For the Hermiones in my class, I gave them a limit of 5 counters that they could ask, or questions they could ask or answer as part of class discussion. Otherwise, they could write them down and I'd come to them later. So they didn't lose the chance to find out more information, but it stopped them dominating the class. So by having these cup and counters, I felt that I was able to allow others to get a chance to get a word in edgeways. It stopped me being biased for some students or biased against other students. So it's actually a really powerful way of checking how well you're going with your questioning, but also making sure that everyone's contributing effectively. Next slide, please. And that's the end of my section, and it's a chance for me to hand back to the rest of the Oxford staff. I hope you found something useful. Please ask me any questions in the chat. I'm happy to answer questions as they appear.
Thanks so much, Helen. And yeah, as Helen mentioned, if you have any questions at all about anything she's covered today, please just pop them into the chat. I'm now going to give a bit of an update on Oxford Science, including how the new edition contains features that support keyword recognition and help students respond to science questions. And a lot of the updates that we've made are based on teacher feedback. So what can you expect in the new edition? Each book starts with a Science Toolkit chapter, which includes information and guidance on important science skills. The Science Toolkit chapters can be used throughout the year as a reference resource, or you can teach them explicitly. In the new edition, we've added a Year 10 toolkit, which is something that previously didn't exist, and it focuses on scaffolding the key science skills needed for senior sciences. We've also made an effort to include some guidance on teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge and cultures, which is a large focus in the curriculum. And all of this content has been reviewed for accuracy, sensitivity, and relevance. Each chapter begins with an inquiry question and a learning pathway that is clearly mapped to the chapter. We've also kept the inquiry-based what-if activities at the start of each chapter as a fun introduction to the topic and to get students thinking. We're maintaining our structure of one concept, one spread, one lesson, and each topic begins with a clear concept statement, and key ideas of the topic are now broken down as dot points. We've defined key terms in the margin to support student understanding and literacy, and case studies provide real-world context and opportunities for application. We've added worked examples for things like data analysis and basic numerical processes like calculating net force, and for processes related to knowledge and skills like calculating magnification in a microscope. And this shows students how to respond to those calculate questions. The Check Your Learning questions are aligned to Bloom's taxonomy and they target curriculum outcomes. To help with keyword recognition, we've bolded all VCAA keywords in the Check Your Learning questions, as well as provided hints on how to answer certain questions to help with student understanding. Our Science as a Human Endeavour spreads incorporates these develop your abilities activities that give students an opportunity to practice a certain skill or capability within the context of their learning, instead of learning it separately. Much like the Check Your Learning questions, the keywords are bolded to help with keyword recognition in students. Chapter reviews provide students with a range of question styles and application opportunities. The VCAA keywords are again bolded throughout to support student understanding, and questions also target capabilities and skills, as well as provide opportunities for extension. Research questions offer prompts for students to investigate relevant topics further, and reflect tables encourage students to consider what they have and haven't learnt. If they aren't comfortable with the topic, they are encouraged to revisit the relevant pages. In the new edition, we've also focused on scaffolding inquiry skills into the experiment discussions and questions, encouraging students to think about what they're doing and why they're doing it. An exciting new feature in the new edition is the inclusion of fully scaffolded curriculum-aligned STEAM projects. Each cross-curricular project covers the science, humanities and maths curriculum and is accompanied by a comprehensive suite of teacher resources, including videos, teacher notes, implementation advice and assessments. These STEAM projects encourage students to work collaboratively, make connections between learning areas and use design thinking to solve real-world problems. So we'll be releasing the new edition of Oxford Science on our new OBook Pro platform. The new OBook Pro comes with an e-reader developed for better digital learning and new assessment functionality to help with assessing, tracking and reporting student progress. This includes curriculum reports that provide an overview of student understanding against curriculum content descriptors. There are full sample chapters that are currently available on our website, or you can get in touch with one of our consultants using the details that will be up on the screen in a moment. Following this webinar, you will receive the sample chapters of Oxford Science, and the recording of this session and page proofs for Year 7 will be sent through late next week, with the remaining years to follow soon after. And now it's time for a Q&A session. If you've got any questions at all about keyword recognition, teaching students how to answer questions, or even about Oxford Science, please just feel free to pop them into the chat, and Helen and one of the publishers, Jenna, will answer them for you.
Hi everyone. So yes, if you have any questions that you wanted to put forward, please put them into the chat now. Helen and I will wait around for a little bit in case anyone has anything they're thinking over, and we'll answer.
Can I add a little bit? I'm especially excited about the STEAM projects. I know one of the biggest problems that trying to get a STEAM program or project going in schools is finding ways for the different areas, getting the maths, the science and humanities and technology teachers talking to each other about how you can find something that fits in with all levels of the curricula. And one of the key things with this is identifying the key areas of the different curriculum and how it all ties together to one problem that you could do with each year level. So I'm very excited by that.
The STEAM projects will be great. We're really looking forward to those. We've had a question come through from Lee Walker. asking us to talk a bit more about the digital assessment. So I'm assuming that refers to the new features of the new OBOOK Pro. So the digital assessment provides an opportunity to engage with your students' learning, basically by reporting their learning against the curriculum. So it will have a series of activities that can be quizzes, formative assessment tasks where they might have to drag and drop, they may have to answer some multiple choice, and this is directly linked to a part of the curriculum which will provide a report for you so you can see how their learning is going. So thank you. If no one has any further questions, I'll hand back to Sanem, who will just conclude the presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jenna. So you can contact your education consultant by heading to oup.com.au/contact. Thank you so much to everyone for attending. We really appreciate you making the time to attend this session, and all the best for the rest of term 3.